She looked into the mirror and saw her sister's bruised face staring back at her. That single image would change everything. That was the night Captain Rachel Mitchell decided that her sister's husband was about to meet a woman he never expected to marry. Not the soft-spoken woman who tolerated his cruelty for 6 long years, but the woman standing in her place now, the one trained to walk into danger without blinking. The one who had spent a decade learning exactly how to make a man confess his darkest secrets before he even realized what was happening. What happened next in that quiet Ohio home was not born out of anger. It was calculated. It was patient. And when it finally unfolded, it would leave one man wondering how he never noticed the woman sleeping beside him wasn't the same one he married that morning. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a decorated Army captain ended up secretly living her twin sister's life, pretending to be a woman she hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a small hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, nearly 29 years earlier, where 2 identical baby girls were born 11 minutes apart. Their mother named them Rachel and Sarah, and from the moment they could walk, the 2 of them were rarely seen apart. Neighbors used to joke that you couldn't tell them apart unless you caught them mid-sentence, because even their voices carried the same rhythm, the same pauses, the same nervous laugh at the end of a joke that wasn't quite funny. But anyone who spent real time around them noticed something deeper than their matching faces. Rachel was the protector. Sarah was the peacemaker. And that single difference in personality would shape the rest of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Their father passed away when the girls were 16, a sudden heart attack that left their mother raising 2 teenage daughters alone on a nurse's salary. Rachel responded to the loss by building walls, throwing herself into structure, discipline, and control, the very things that would later draw her toward a career in the United States Army. Sarah responded differently. She leaned into comfort, into connection, into the desperate need to be loved by someone who would never leave her the way their father had. It's a small detail, almost easy to overlook, but people who study patterns of abuse will tell you that this exact emotional wound, the fear of abandonment planted young, often becomes the very thing predators are trained to notice and exploit. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was about to meet a man who noticed that wound immediately. Rachel enlisted the day she turned 18. She wanted distance, structure, a mission bigger than her grief. Over the next several years, she would serve 2 overseas deployments, earn the rank of captain, and develop a set of skills most people only see in movies: reading body language, detecting deception, staying calm under extreme pressure, controlling every micro-expression on her own face while missing nothing on someone else's. Meanwhile, back home, Sarah stayed close to their mother, went to community college, worked as a receptionist at a dental office, and quietly waited for a version of love she had only ever seen in movies. That's exactly where Derek Coleman found her. He was 26, confident, well-dressed, a former college athlete who had a way of making every woman in the room feel like the only one worth talking to. Sarah was 24 when they met, and within 4 months, he had already told her he loved her more than anyone ever had. Rachel wasn't there for most of it. She was stationed overseas during their entire courtship, catching pieces of the relationship through phone calls and grainy video chats that dropped every few minutes. But even through a cracked screen and a 2-second delay, she noticed something in the way Derek spoke to her sister. A certain tone, casual on the surface but unmistakably possessive underneath, the kind of comment disguised as a joke that quietly reminds a woman who's really in charge. Rachel mentioned it once during a video call, gently, carefully, the way you approach a friend who's already made up her mind. Sarah laughed it off. She told her sister she was overthinking it, that military life had made her suspicious of everyone, that not every man was the enemy. Rachel let it go, not because she believed it, but because she trusted her sister to know her own heart. It's a decision she would spend years quietly regretting. The wedding happened 8 months later, while Rachel was still stationed overseas and unable to attend. She watched it through photos sent by their mother, Sarah in a simple white dress, Derek in a gray suit, both of them smiling under string lights in their mother's backyard. Everyone said it was beautiful. Everyone said Derek was charming, generous, the perfect son-in-law. For the first 2 years, from what Rachel could tell through phone calls and holiday visits, the marriage looked stable, even happy. Sarah seemed content, if a little quieter than before, a little more careful with her words, a little slower to laugh the way she used to. Rachel noticed these shifts the way a soldier notices a change in terrain, small, easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore once you start counting them. Still, distance and duty kept her from acting on instinct. She had a career, a deployment schedule, an ocean between herself and the one person she had promised to protect since childhood. The cracks started showing more clearly around year 4. Sarah began canceling video calls at the last minute. She stopped posting photos of herself, only pictures of their home, their dog, the garden Derek had built in the backyard. When Rachel did manage to get her on camera, Sarah wore long sleeves even in the middle of summer, and her laugh, once loud and easy, had turned careful, measured, like she was checking herself before every sound left her mouth. Rachel asked about it directly during one call, and Sarah's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, an answer that sounded like it had been practiced in a mirror. That was the moment Rachel's training kicked in without her even realizing it. She had spent years learning to recognize when someone was hiding something, and everything about her sister's voice told her that Sarah was hiding a great deal. Rachel requested leave for the first time in over a year, determined to see her sister in person, determined to look her in the eyes without a screen or a delay between them. But before her leave was even approved, before she could book a flight home, her phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was Sarah's voice on the other end, barely above a whisper, shaking in a way Rachel had never heard before, not even during the most dangerous moments of her own deployments. Sarah didn't say much. She didn't need to. She simply said her sister's name, followed by 4 words that would change the course of both their lives forever. She said, "Rach, I need you." Rachel didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She was in her car within minutes, driving through the dark toward a house she hadn't set foot in for nearly 2 years, toward a sister she barely recognized anymore, and toward a man she was about to learn far more about than she ever wanted to know. When Rachel arrived, the porch light was off, and the curtains were drawn tight across every window facing the street. Sarah opened the door before Rachel even reached it, and for a moment, neither sister said a word. The face staring back at Rachel was her own face, the same eyes, the same jawline, the same features they had shared since birth, except this version of that face carried a swollen cheek and a bruise blooming dark purple along her left eye. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, something cold and deliberate replacing the panic she expected to feel. She had seen injuries like this before, in training exercises, in briefings on domestic violence patterns the Army required all officers to study, but she had never expected to see it on her own sister's face. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and asked only one question. She asked what happened. Sarah's answer came out in fragments, an argument about money, an accusation about a text message that wasn't what it looked like, a slammed door, a raised hand, and then silence. Sarah begged her sister not to call the police. She said she was scared of what Derek would do if she pressed charges, scared of losing the house, scared of what people in town would say about her, scared most of all that she wouldn't be believed, because Derek Coleman was the kind of man everyone in that community adored, coaching Little League on weekends, attending church every Sunday, shaking every hand at the block party with a smile people trusted completely. Rachel listened to every word without interrupting, without judgment, without the anger that was already building quietly beneath her calm exterior. When Sarah finally finished speaking, Rachel said something that surprised even herself. She told her sister she didn't need to fix this alone anymore, because Rachel was going to fix it for her. Sarah asked what she meant, and Rachel simply said 4 words back to her. She said, "You don't have to." The plan Rachel proposed that night sounded almost impossible when she first said it out loud, but the more she explained it, the more Sarah realized her sister had already thought through every detail. Sarah would leave immediately, driven that same night to their mother's house 2 states away, somewhere safe, somewhere Derek would never think to look right away. Rachel would stay behind and take her place, living in that house, sleeping in that bed, answering that phone, using every skill she had spent a decade sharpening in combat zones to observe a man who had no idea he was being watched. Sarah hesitated at first, terrified of what Derek might do if he discovered the switch before Rachel was ready. But Rachel reminded her of something their mother used to say when they were children, that people rarely look closely at what they already believe they understand. Derek believed he understood his wife completely. He had no idea he was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Over the following 2 days, Rachel studied her sister the way she once studied enemy movement patterns during deployment, methodically, patiently, without missing a single detail. She learned the way Sarah answered the phone, the specific words she used when texting her mother, the playlist she kept in her car, the exact way she poured her morning coffee before adding 2 sugars and a splash of cream. She memorized the passcode to Sarah's phone, the names saved under nicknames instead of real names, the pattern of who texted her and when. She studied old photographs to master Sarah's posture, her walk, the particular way she tilted her head when she was pretending to listen to something she found boring. It wasn't just impersonation. It was reconnaissance, the same discipline that had kept her alive in hostile territory, now being used to protect the one person she couldn't afford to lose. By the 3rd day, Rachel was ready to walk back into that house as her sister, and Derek would never suspect a thing. The first few days inside the house were quiet, almost unnervingly normal. Derek came home from work at the same time every evening, kissed Rachel on the cheek without hesitation, and talked about his day as if nothing had happened just 72 hours earlier. He never mentioned the bruise. He never mentioned the argument. He behaved, in fact, like a man who believed the incident had already been forgiven and forgotten, the way it apparently always had been before. Rachel played her role carefully, matching Sarah's tone, her habits, her careful way of avoiding certain topics at dinner. But behind her calm expression, she was cataloging everything, memorizing patterns, watching for the smallest inconsistencies in his story, exactly the way she had been trained to detect deception during years of military interrogation courses. It didn't take long before she found the first crack in his carefully maintained image, a phone he thought was hidden well enough, tucked behind a false panel in the garage, buzzing quietly with messages from a number saved only as a set of initials. Rachel didn't confront him immediately. She understood something most people don't, that impatience destroys operations that patience could otherwise complete successfully. Instead, she waited, watched, and quietly documented everything she found, transferring messages, photographing bank statements that revealed withdrawals Sarah had never approved, listening carefully during phone calls Derek assumed were private. Within a week, she had uncovered far more than a bruise and an argument over money. She discovered nearly $12,000 missing from a joint savings account, funneled slowly over 18 months into expenses that had nothing to do with their household. She discovered text messages to a woman he'd been seeing for over a year, messages that revealed not just an affair, but a pattern of manipulation eerily similar to what he'd done to Sarah in the earliest days of their relationship. Piece by piece, the man everyone in town admired was revealing himself to be someone entirely different behind closed doors, and Rachel intended to make sure the whole truth came out into the open. The final piece of the plan required something Rachel had learned during hostage negotiation training years earlier, the art of provoking a controlled reaction without revealing your own intentions. One evening, she casually mentioned finding a phone charger in the garage, phrasing it carefully enough that a defensive man would either explain it away calmly or panic and overreact. Derek chose panic. He raised his voice, accused her of going through his things, accused her of not trusting him after everything he claimed to have done for their marriage, and in his anger, he said far more than he intended to say. He mentioned the woman by name. He mentioned the money, dismissing it as something he deserved for putting up with a wife who, in his words, never appreciated him. He even referenced, almost as a threat, what would happen if she ever tried to leave him the way she had threatened to before. Every word was captured on a small recorder Rachel had hidden inside a decorative candle on the kitchen counter 3 days earlier. When Derek finally calmed down, believing he had successfully intimidated his wife into silence once again, Rachel excused herself to the bedroom and made a single phone call. 2 hours later, Sarah returned to the house for the first time since the night she left, walking through the front door just as Derek was pouring himself a drink in the kitchen, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He turned around, expecting to see his wife standing where he'd left her only moments earlier, and instead found himself staring at 2 identical faces standing side by side in the doorway, one calm and composed in a military stance he didn't recognize, the other quiet but resolute in a way he had never seen before. The color drained from his face almost instantly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, because in that single moment, he understood with absolute certainty that everything he had said over the past week had not been said to his wife at all. Rachel didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply pressed play on the recording she had captured 3 days earlier, letting his own words fill the silence of the kitchen, the confession about the affair, the admission about the stolen money, the veiled threat about what would happen if Sarah ever tried to leave. Derek's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something close to fear as he realized a lawyer, already contacted in brief days in advance, had copies of everything, along with documentation of the financial theft that had already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities for review. Rachel explained calmly, almost clinically, that his choices over the past week hadn't just exposed his affair or his theft. They had handed Sarah every piece of leverage she would ever need in the divorce that was about to follow, along with a paper trail serious enough to draw attention from more than just a family court judge. Derek said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. The following months moved quickly once the truth came out into the open. Sarah's lawyer used the recorded confession and financial documentation to secure a settlement far more favorable than anyone initially expected, one that accounted for the stolen funds and ensured Sarah retained the home that had once felt more like a prison than a place of comfort. Word of the affair and the theft spread through their small community faster than Derek could control, and the same neighbors who once admired him at church and Little League games began quietly distancing themselves from a man they no longer recognized. He lost his job within 2 months after his employer learned about the financial misconduct uncovered during the divorce proceedings, and by the end of the year, he had moved out of state entirely, starting over somewhere no one knew his name or his history. Sarah, meanwhile, began rebuilding a life that finally felt like her own again, enrolling in night classes she had once given up years earlier, reconnecting with friends she'd quietly drifted from during her marriage, and slowly rediscovering a version of herself that had been buried under 6 years of fear and silence. Rachel returned to active duty 3 weeks after the confrontation, but the two sisters remained closer than they had been in years, speaking almost every day, a habit neither of them intended to break again. When people eventually heard the full story, some through mutual friends, others through the small-town rumor mill that rarely stayed quiet for long, reactions varied. Some praised Rachel's calculated bravery, calling it exactly the kind of protection every sister deserves. Others questioned whether impersonating someone, even to expose the truth, crossed an ethical line that shouldn't be crossed regardless of intention. But for Sarah, the answer was never complicated. She had spent 6 years believing she had to face her fear entirely alone, convinced no one would ever truly understand what was happening behind closed doors. It took her sister, trained not in courtrooms or therapy offices, but in combat zones and interrogation rooms, to prove her wrong in the most unexpected way imaginable. This story leaves us with a question worth sitting with long after the video ends. Derek Coleman spent 6 years believing he had married a woman who would never fight back, never expose him, never truly see him for who he really was. He never imagined that woman had a twin sister who already knew exactly how to win wars far more dangerous than the one happening inside his own kitchen. Was justice truly served in this case? Or should consequences have extended further, beyond a lost marriage and a damaged reputation, into the kind of legal accountability that fits the severity of what he had done? Let us know in the comments below what you would have done in Rachel's position, and whether you believe deception in the name of protection can ever be fully justified. If this story kept you watching until the very end, make sure you're subscribed, because the next story we're about to share involves a secret discovered only after 15 years of marriage, one hidden not behind a bruise, but across 2 entirely different states. Rachel's return to active duty didn't happen without conversation. Before she drove back to the base, she and Sarah sat together in their mother's kitchen for nearly 3 hours, drinking coffee that went cold before either of them touched it, talking through everything that had happened with the kind of honesty that only surfaces when the danger has finally passed and the adrenaline has worn off completely. Sarah admitted things she had never said out loud before, not to her mother, not to a therapist, not to the one friend from work she had occasionally confided in during the worst years of her marriage. She admitted that there had been moments, particularly in year 3 and year 4, when she had genuinely convinced herself that what Derek was doing to her was somehow her fault, that if she could just be calmer, quieter, more agreeable, more patient, The version of him she fell in love with would eventually return. She said she had spent an enormous amount of energy trying to manage his moods, predicting his reactions, adjusting her behavior in advance to avoid triggering a response she had learned to fear. Therapists have a clinical term for this pattern of behavior, and it appears in the majority of documented long-term domestic abuse cases across the United States. But sitting in her mother's kitchen that morning, Sarah didn't use clinical language. She simply said she had forgotten what it felt like to make a decision without first calculating how Derek would react to it. Rachel listened to every word without interrupting, without offering solutions or corrections, simply absorbing the weight of what her sister was describing. When Sarah finally went quiet, Rachel reached across the table and covered her sister's hand with her own, and the two of them sat in silence for a long time, the way people do when words have temporarily run out of usefulness. What happened to Sarah during those 6 years of marriage is not an isolated story, and it is important to pause here and acknowledge that, because the details of her experience mirror patterns documented in thousands of cases studied by researchers, law enforcement professionals, and domestic violence advocates across the country every single year. According to data compiled by the National Domestic Violence Hotline, approximately 1 in 4 women in the United States will experience severe intimate partner physical violence at some point during their lifetime. More significant for understanding Sarah's story is a separate statistic, one that explains why she stayed as long as she did and why she begged Rachel not to call the police that first night. Research consistently shows that on average, a victim of domestic abuse will leave and return to an abusive relationship between 6 and 8 times before making a final departure. This is not weakness. It is the documented psychological result of a systematic process that abusers use to erode a person's sense of reality, self-worth, and capacity to trust their own judgment over an extended period of time. Derek Coleman, whether consciously or instinctively, had followed this playbook with disturbing precision from almost the very beginning of their relationship. The control began long before the first physical incident, which is almost always the case in relationships that eventually escalate to violence. Derek's early tactics were subtle enough that Sarah herself didn't recognize them for what they were until years after the fact, and even then, only with the help of a therapist she began seeing 3 months after the divorce was finalized. He started by gradually narrowing her social world, not through direct demands, but through a series of small, almost reasonable-sounding preferences. He preferred her to come home directly after work rather than stopping for drinks with coworkers, because he worried about her driving late at night. He felt more comfortable when she checked in with him during the day, not because he didn't trust her, he always said, but because he simply liked knowing she was safe. He expressed mild disappointment when she made plans without consulting him first, framing it as a desire to spend more time together rather than a need to monitor her movements. Each individual behavior carried a plausible explanation, a justification rooted in language that sounded like love rather than control. It was only when Sarah looked back at all of them together, as a connected pattern rather than isolated incidents, that the full architecture of what he had built became visible. By year 2, Sarah had stopped seeing most of her friends on a regular basis, not because Derek had explicitly forbidden it, but because the emotional cost of dealing with his reaction afterward had gradually made it easier to simply decline invitations in the first place. By year 3, she had quietly stepped back from a promotion opportunity at work because Derek had made clear, without ever issuing a direct ultimatum, that he found the idea of her working longer hours and earning more than him profoundly uncomfortable. By year 4, the financial control had become complete enough that Sarah had no independent access to money beyond a small allowance Derek deposited into a separate account each month, an amount carefully calibrated to cover groceries and household necessities with nothing left over for anything that might give her independence or mobility. And underneath all of it, running like a constant current through every year of the marriage, was the fear, not always of violence, but of his moods, his silences, his ability to make her feel responsible for the emotional temperature of every room they shared. The bruise Rachel saw that night was not the beginning of what Derek had done to her sister. It was simply the first time it had left a mark visible enough that denial was no longer an option. Understanding this context matters because it changes the way we interpret Rachel's decision to step in the way she did. A lot of people, when they first hear the broad outline of this story, the twin swap, the hidden recorder, the confrontation, focused primarily on the dramatic elements, the cleverness of the plan, the satisfaction of watching Derek's composure collapse in real time. But the deeper story is about something more fundamental than a clever plan. It is about what happens when a system that is supposed to protect people fails them quietly and consistently, leaving the people who love them to improvise solutions in the gaps that system leaves behind. Sarah had not gone to the police the night of the incident, not because she lacked courage, but because she had watched enough of her neighbors' experiences and read enough news headlines to understand what the realistic outcome of that call was likely to be. She knew that without documentation, without a pattern established on paper, without a lawyer already in her corner, the most probable result was a report filed, a night apart, and Derek back in that house within 24 hours, except now knowing that she had called for help. The fear of that outcome was not irrational. It was based on a clear-eyed assessment of the options available to her, and every one of them felt impossible to survive alone. Rachel understood this calculation because she had seen versions of it before, not in domestic situations, but in the kind of operational environments where every decision carries consequences and where the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one often comes down to preparation, timing, and information. What she did inside that house over the course of those days was not improvised. It was disciplined, methodical, and deeply informed by training most people will never receive. She didn't plant the recorder in the kitchen on her first day inside the house. She waited 4 days before placing it, spending those initial days doing nothing but observing, establishing Derek's rhythms, identifying his patterns, noting the specific emotional triggers that caused him to lose his careful composure and reveal something closer to his actual character. She had learned years earlier that people under stress revert to habit, and that a person's habits reveal far more about their true nature than their behavior during calm, controlled moments. Everything she needed from Derek was already inside him. She simply needed to create the right conditions for it to come out. The financial documentation Rachel uncovered during those days inside the house became one of the most significant components of what followed legally. The $12,000 missing from the joint savings account was not taken in one large withdrawal that would have triggered immediate suspicion. It had been moved in increments ranging from $150 to $800 at a time, spread across 18 months, always timed around periods when Sarah was distracted, a minor illness, a busy stretch at work, the weeks surrounding their anniversary, when she was emotionally preoccupied and less likely to scrutinize bank statements carefully. The pattern was methodical enough that when Sarah's lawyer reviewed the documentation Rachel had compiled, he noted that it demonstrated a level of deliberate planning inconsistent with the impulsive financial mismanagement Derek would later attempt to claim during early divorce proceedings. The transfers hadn't gone into a general personal account. They had been funneled into a secondary account opened under a variation of Derek's middle name, an account that also happened to receive occasional deposits from an employer Sarah had never heard Derek mention. The lawyer described the financial picture as one of the clearest cases of marital asset concealment he had seen in over 20 years of family law practice, and that assessment shaped the settlement negotiations significantly. The affair, while deeply painful for Sarah to confront in its full detail, ultimately served a secondary role in the legal proceedings compared to the financial misconduct. The woman involved, whose name never became part of the public record, had been in contact with Derek for over 14 months at the time Rachel made the discovery. Their relationship had apparently begun as a professional connection before shifting into something more personal, and the text messages Rachel photographed revealed that Derek had represented himself to this woman in terms that bore almost no resemblance to the life he was actually living at home. He had described his marriage as effectively over for years, characterized Sarah as emotionally unstable and financially irresponsible, and made at least 2 references to plans he claimed to be making for a future that did not include his wife. What struck Rachel most, reading through those messages during a quiet evening alone in the house, was not the betrayal itself but the ease with which Derek had constructed 2 entirely parallel narratives, one for each woman, each one internally consistent, each one carefully maintained, neither one bearing much relationship to observable reality. It was a form of deception that required sustained effort and genuine skill, and recognizing it for what it was helped Rachel understand something important. Derek Coleman was not a man who had made a series of poor choices under pressure. He was a man who had been making deliberate, calculated decisions for a very long time. The night of the confrontation itself, the moment Rachel pressed play on that recording and watched Derek's carefully constructed world collapse in real time, lasted less than 40 minutes from beginning to end. Derek initially attempted to deny the recording was genuine, claiming the audio was unclear, that his words were being taken out of context, that Rachel, whom he now knew had been impersonating his wife for over a week, had no legal standing to use anything she had gathered through what he called deception. Rachel had anticipated this response. She had spoken to a lawyer before the confrontation and understood the relevant legal landscape well enough to know that the admissibility of the recording in a criminal proceeding might be complicated depending on the specific statutes of their state, but that its value in a civil divorce proceeding was substantial regardless. More importantly, she had made sure that the financial documentation, which was entirely separate from the recording and had been gathered from joint account records Sarah had full legal right to access, was already in the hands of two separate legal professionals before Derek said a single word that evening. The recording was not the trap. It was simply the moment Derek understood he was already inside one. What happened to Derek in the months following the confrontation unfolded with a kind of quiet inevitability that people who knew him found almost surreal to watch from the outside. The divorce proceedings moved faster than most, partly because of the strength of the documentation and partly because Derek's lawyer, recognizing the weight of what they were working against, counseled him to accept terms rather than contest them in open court, where the full record would become part of the public file. The settlement required him to repay the full amount of the missing funds with interest, surrender his claim to the house, and accept a financial arrangement that left him considerably less stable than he had been during the marriage. His employer, a mid-sized regional company where Derek had worked in a client-facing sales role for 4 years, became aware of the financial misconduct findings through a combination of the public divorce record and the quiet conversations that spread through a small community faster than any official announcement. They did not renew his contract when it came up for review 8 weeks after the settlement was finalized, citing performance concerns and language carefully chosen to avoid exposing the company to any legal liability of its own. Within 6 months of that evening in the kitchen, Derek Coleman had lost his marriage, his home, his job, and the community standing he had spent years cultivating with handshakes and volunteering and Sunday morning church attendance. He relocated before the end of the year, and the people who had once called him a friend found that they didn't particularly miss him once he was gone. Sarah's recovery was not linear, and she has never pretended otherwise to the people closest to her. The months immediately following the divorce were harder in some ways than the years of the marriage itself, which surprises people when she describes it, but which therapists who specialize in trauma recovery will tell you is entirely common. During the marriage, even a bad one, even a frightening one, the structure itself provides a kind of framework that organizes daily life and provides predictability, however painful that predictability might be. When that structure is suddenly removed, even by choice, even with relief, the absence of it can feel disorienting in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Sarah described the first 2 months after Derek left the house as feeling like she was learning to walk again in a room where the floor kept shifting slightly under her feet. She knew she was free. She knew she was safe. But her nervous system, conditioned over 6 years to anticipate threat and manage conflict, didn't immediately receive that message and believe it. She would wake at 3 in the morning and lie still in the dark, listening for sounds that were no longer there, bracing for a tension that no longer existed, her body still running its old protective programming in an environment where it was no longer needed. Therapy helped, slowly and then more noticeably. Her therapist, a woman she began seeing through a domestic violence survivors resource program 3 months after the divorce was finalized, introduced her to a concept that became central to her recovery. The understanding that the adaptive behaviors she had developed to survive her marriage, the hypervigilance, the constant emotional monitoring of the people around her, the instinct to minimize her own needs in anticipation of someone else's reaction, had been genuinely useful tools in a genuinely dangerous environment. They had helped her survive. The work of recovery wasn't about condemning those instincts, but about slowly teaching her nervous system that the danger had passed, and that the old tools were no longer the ones most needed for the life ahead of her. It was painstaking work, unglamorous and unglamorous looking from the outside. Nothing like the dramatic confrontation in the kitchen that people tended to focus on when they heard the story. But Sarah has said in private conversations that the therapy, more than anything else including the confrontation itself, was the moment her actual liberation began. By the end of the first year after the divorce, the changes in Sarah were visible enough that people who hadn't seen her in some time commented on them almost immediately. She had returned to school, enrolling in an evening program at the community college she had attended years before meeting Derek, pursuing a degree in social work with a specific focus on advocacy for domestic violence survivors. The irony was not lost on her that the experience she had most wanted to hide had become the experience she now felt most equipped to use in service of other people navigating the same darkness. She became a volunteer with a local shelter program during her second year of study, sitting with women in the earliest and most fragile days of their departures, offering not advice or solutions, but simply the steady presence of someone who understood without needing anything explained. The women she sat with could tell, immediately and instinctively the way survivors often can recognize each other, that she was not speaking from theory. She was speaking from somewhere real, somewhere lived, somewhere that had cost her something before it gave her something back. Rachel followed Sarah's progress from a distance at first, then more closely as their communication settled back into the daily rhythm it had carried during their childhood, before deployments and marriage and geography had pulled it apart. She returned to active duty and completed her remaining service commitment with the same discipline and focus that had defined her entire military career, but she has said to Sarah on more than one occasion that the operation inside that Ohio house, if you could call it that, was among the most personally significant things she had ever done in a life full of significant challenges. Not because it was particularly complicated from a tactical standpoint. She has always been clear that it was far simpler than the situations she navigated overseas, but because of what it represented in terms of what she was protecting. Soldiers are trained to protect people they will never meet, abstract populations, national interests, strategic objectives that are real but distant. What she had done inside that house was protect one specific person, the first person she had ever loved, using every skill she possessed, and the outcome of it had changed the actual course of that person's actual life in ways she could see and measure and feel. That, she has said, hit differently than anything a uniform or a rank or a commendation could ever capture. The question people most frequently ask when they hear this story in full is whether what Rachel did was right, and the honest answer is that it depends entirely on which framework you apply to the question. From a strictly legal standpoint, her actions occupied a complicated gray area. Impersonating another person, even a twin sister with that person's full knowledge and consent, raises questions that vary in their legal implications depending on jurisdiction, context, and outcome. The recording she made, while potentially admissible in civil proceedings, would have faced significant challenges in a criminal context under the wiretapping statutes of most states. Rachel has acknowledged this openly and has never claimed that everything she did existed in a clean, ethical space free of complication. What she has argued, consistently and without apology, is that she made a decision in an environment where the systems designed to handle that situation had already failed to protect her sister for 6 years, and that she used the tools available to her to fill a gap those systems left open. Reasonable people can disagree about whether that justifies her methods. What is considerably harder to dispute is what the outcome was for the woman those methods were designed to protect. Sarah Mitchell today is not the same woman who opened a darkened front door in the middle of the night and said her sister's name in a voice shaking with fear. She finished her degree and works full-time with a regional advocacy organization that serves survivors of intimate partner violence across 3 counties. She speaks at community events when asked, carefully and selectively, sharing pieces of her story in ways she has decided are useful without exposing more than she chooses to. She owns her home, manages her finances, makes her own decisions, and wakes up in the morning to a life that is entirely, unreservedly her own. She has said that she doesn't spend much time thinking about Derek or where he ended up or what his life looks like now. Not because she is indifferent to the concept of justice, but because she discovered somewhere in the process of building her new life that the most satisfying form of accountability she could offer him was simply to thrive, loudly and completely, in the life he had spent 6 years trying to diminish. And Rachel, the woman who drove through the dark toward a house she hadn't visited in 2 years, and walked into it wearing her sister's life like a second skin, continues to serve, continues to lead, and continues to be the person she has always been since the two of them were children in matching dresses. The one who shows up when the situation requires someone willing to stand in the gap. Some people are built for exactly the moment they are called to. Rachel Mitchell always was. She simply never expected the most important battlefield of her life to be a kitchen in Ohio. But then again, the most important battles rarely look the way we expect them to when they finally arrive. This is a story about twins, yes, and about a plan that sounds almost too extraordinary to be real. But beneath all of that, it is a story about something far more ordinary and far more universal. The question of who shows up for us when we can no longer show up for ourselves, and what we owe each other in the moments when the systems around us have failed to deliver the protection they promised. Derek Coleman lost everything he had built, not because of a dramatic legal proceeding or a viral social media moment, but because he had spent years underestimating the woman he married and had never once considered that she might have someone in her corner willing to fight the way he never imagined anyone would fight. That miscalculation cost him everything. And somewhere in that outcome, if you look carefully enough, there is something that resembles justice, imperfect and complicated and arrived at through unconventional means, but real nonetheless. And in the lives of people the formal system leaves behind, real is often the best and only thing that matters. Before we close, we want to ask you something directly, and we genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments below. If you were in Rachel's position, knowing everything she knew, watching your sister's face through a screen for years and recognizing the signs that something was deeply wrong, would you have done what she did, or would you have found a different way to fight for her? And do you believe that what Derek ultimately faced was proportionate to what he did, or should the consequences have extended further into formal legal accountability beyond the civil proceedings that ultimately concluded this case? Let us know where you stand, because this story raises questions that don't have simple answers, and the conversation that happens in the comments below is part of what makes stories like this one worth telling. If you watch this all the way to the end, thank you for staying with us, and please make sure you are subscribed so that when our next story goes live, you are the first to see it. Because the next story we are about to bring you involves a secret that survived 15 years of marriage and 2 children and a house in the suburbs and a life that looked, from every angle anyone could see, exactly the way a happy life is supposed to look, right up until the day it didn't. You will not want to miss it. The story of Rachel and Sarah Mitchell did not end when Derek Coleman drove out of that Ohio town with whatever remained of his reputation packed into the back of a rented moving truck. In many ways, the most important chapters of both their lives were only just beginning in the months that followed, written not in the dramatic language of confrontations and confessions, but in the quieter, more demanding vocabulary of rebuilding, of learning to trust again, of figuring out who you are when the thing that defined you for years has finally been removed. These are the chapters that rarely make it into the versions of stories like this one that circulate online or get discussed over dinner tables, because they lack the sharp edges and satisfying turns of the confrontation itself. But they're the chapters that matter most, because they are where the actual work happens, the slow, unglamorous, deeply personal work of becoming someone new while still carrying everything the old version of you survived. Sarah threw herself into her studies with an intensity that surprised even her therapist, who had encouraged her to pace herself during the first year of recovery, reminding her that the impulse to fill every available hour with productive activity was sometimes a way of avoiding the quieter emotional work that couldn't be rushed or scheduled. Sarah understood this intellectually and nodded at all the right moments during their sessions, but the truth was that sitting still felt dangerous in a way she struggled to articulate. When she was moving, studying, reading, volunteering, attending class, she was building something. And building something meant that the future was real and approaching and hers to shape. When she was still, the silence had a way of filling itself with things she wasn't ready to sit with yet. Memories that surfaced without invitation, moments from the marriage that her mind kept returning to and examining from new angles, searching for the exact point where she could have seen what was coming and chosen differently. Her therapist helped her understand gradually that this search for the moment of failure was itself a symptom of the way abuse reshapes a person's internal narrative, training them to locate the source of the problem inside themselves rather than in the person who is actually responsible. It was a reframe that took months to truly absorb, not just intellectually but emotionally, in the way that real understanding settles into the body rather than just the mind. The social work program Sarah enrolled in had a practicum component in its second year that placed students in field positions with community organizations, and Sarah was assigned to a regional family services agency that operated a 24-hour crisis hotline alongside its in-person shelter program. Her supervisor, a woman in her 50s who had worked in the field for nearly 3 decades and had seen every variation of the situations Sarah was now encountering for the first time, recognized something in Sarah during her first week that she mentioned later in a performance review. She wrote that Sarah demonstrated an unusual capacity for what she called grounded presence, the ability to remain calm and steady and fully attentive in the company of someone in acute distress without either emotionally collapsing alongside them or retreating into the kind of clinical distance that makes a person feel processed rather than heard. It was, her supervisor noted, a quality that couldn't be taught in a classroom and that took most practitioners years in the field to develop, if they developed it at all. Sarah read that review 3 times before filing it away, not out of vanity, but because it was the first time in longer than she could clearly remember that someone had described her as possessing a strength rather than lacking something. The hotline work was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she has said this plainly in conversations with people who ask her about her job, including Rachel, who asked her once how she managed to absorb that level of pain on a daily basis without it destroying her from the inside out. Sarah's answer was careful and considered, the answer of someone who had thought about the question seriously rather than reaching for the convenient version. She said that what she brought to every call was not distance and not detachment, but something more like informed companionship, the knowledge that she had sat in the exact chair the person on the other end of the line was sitting in, that she had made the exact calculations they were making, that she understood from the inside rather than the outside what it meant to know you needed to leave, and to simultaneously understand with complete clarity every reason why leaving felt impossible. She said that when a woman called the hotline at 2 in the morning and said she didn't know what to do, Sarah never told her what to do, because she knew from her own experience that being told what to do by someone who couldn't possibly understand your specific situation was not help. What she offered instead was the thing she herself had most needed during the years of her marriage and had most often been unable to find. Someone who would simply stay on the line and make the darkness a little less total by being present in it alongside her. Rachel visited twice during Sarah's first year after the divorce, once in the early months when Sarah was still in the raw, disorienting early stages of her recovery, and once near the end of the year when enough time had passed that the two of them could sit together and actually talk about what had happened rather than simply managing the immediate emotional fallout of it. The first visit was quiet, practical, oriented around the concrete tasks of settling into a life that was now entirely Sarah's own, setting up bank accounts, reviewing the financial settlement, making sure the house, which was now solely in Sarah's name, was structurally and mechanically sound in ways that Derek, who had controlled all household maintenance decisions, had apparently allowed to slip during the later years of the marriage. Rachel approached these tasks the way she approached everything, systematically and without drama, making lists and checking things off and never once making Sarah feel incapable or dependent, which was the thing Sarah had feared most about accepting help from anyone after years of Derek framing her as unable to manage without him. Rachel's particular gift as a helper was that she helped in a way that never diminished the person she was helping, a quality that probably had something to do with her military training, but that Sarah suspected was also simply part of who her sister had always been. The second visit, near the end of the first year, was different in texture and tone. They cooked dinner together in the kitchen that had once been the site of the confrontation, and at some point during the meal Sarah started laughing at something Rachel said and couldn't stop, the kind of deep, helpless laughter that has nothing to do with what actually triggered it and everything to do with the pressure that has been building beneath the surface waiting for a safe enough moment to release. Rachel started laughing too, and for a while neither of them could speak, and when they finally quieted down Sarah looked at her sister across the table and said something she had been trying to find the right words for since the night she had driven away from that house and left Rachel behind inside it. She said she was sorry it had taken her so long to ask for help. Rachel's response was immediate and firm. She told her sister that she had nothing to apologize for, that surviving the way she had survived for 6 years was not a failure of courage or clarity, but evidence of exactly the opposite. That the decision to finally make that phone call, even at 3 in the morning, even shaking and terrified, was the bravest thing she had ever watched anyone do. Sarah said later that she didn't fully believe it in that moment, but that it was the right thing to have heard, and that she had returned to it many times in the months that followed whenever the internal narrative tried to drag her back toward blame. Meanwhile, in the months after Derek relocated, fragments of information about his whereabouts and circumstances filtered back to the small Ohio community through the informal channels that small communities have always used to circulate information about people who have left under difficult circumstances. He had moved to a city several hours away where he had a distant connection through a former college teammate, and initial reports suggested he had found work in a sales capacity at a company that didn't know his history or hadn't looked closely enough at what a thorough background check might have surfaced. Whether any of that was entirely accurate was difficult to verify, because the people passing the information along were several degrees removed from the source, and accuracy tends to degrade across that kind of distance. What was clearer, based on the limited information that reached people who had known him directly, was that the move had not been a fresh start in the triumphant sense he might have imagined. A man who had defined himself largely through community standing and social approval, who had built his entire public identity around being liked and respected and admired in the specific environment where he lived and worked, does not easily reconstitute that identity in a new place where no one knows his name, particularly when the reason for the relocation is the kind that tends to surface eventually in the ordinary course of human interaction. People talk. Connections reveal themselves. And a man whose last significant chapter ended the way Derek's had ends tends to carry that chapter with him, whether he intends to or not. There is a dimension of this story that deserves attention, and that is easy to overlook when the focus stays on the dramatic elements, and that is the role their mother played throughout everything that happened, before, during, and after. Margaret Mitchell, the woman who had raised 2 daughters alone after their father's death, and who had watched one of them marry Derek Coleman, with the particular mixture of hope and unease that mothers often carry into their children's weddings, had known something was wrong with Sarah's marriage for years before the night Rachel drove through the dark to answer her sister's call. She had noticed the changes in Sarah the way mothers notice things, not through any single moment of revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small signals, the shortened phone calls, the carefully worded answers to direct questions, the way Sarah's laugh had changed its quality over the years from something spontaneous and unguarded to something that arrived a half-second late, like a translation of a feeling rather than the feeling itself. Margaret had tried, more than once, to open a direct conversation with her daughter about what she was observing, and each time Sarah had redirected the conversation with a skill that Margaret recognized in retrospect as the practiced deflection of someone who had been managing other people's perceptions of her life for a very long time. When Sarah arrived at Margaret's house on that night, driven there by Rachel, while Derek was still unaware of anything that had happened, Margaret met her daughter at the door the way she had met both her daughters at every door for their entire lives, without conditions and without questions that couldn't wait. She made the bed in the spare room and brought Sarah tea she didn't ask for and sat with her in the dark for a long time without speaking, because Margaret Mitchell had lived long enough to understand that some moments do not benefit from words, and that the most powerful thing a person can offer someone who has finally come home after a long time away is simply the evidence that home is still there. She did not ask Sarah to explain what had happened in detail that night or in the days that followed. She did not express anger at Derek in Sarah's presence, even though the anger was real and enormous, because she understood instinctively that her daughter did not need to manage anyone else's emotions on top of her own during those early days. She simply provided the environment, the steadiness, the unchanged quality of a love that had not been conditional on Sarah's ability to have her life together, and she trusted that the rest would follow in its own time. It did follow, slowly and imperfectly, and with setbacks that Sarah handled with increasing steadiness as the months passed. There were bad days, weeks that felt like regression, moments when the progress she had made seemed to dissolve overnight, and she found herself back in the emotional landscape of the marriage, anxious and self-doubting, and convinced at some deep, irrational level that she had somehow caused everything that had happened to her. Her therapist had warned her that recovery was not linear, and had explained the neurological basis for why traumatic experiences leave patterns in the nervous system that can be reactivated by stress or fatigue or seemingly unrelated triggers, and Sarah had understood this in the abstract before she experienced it directly. Experiencing it directly was different. On the worst days, the knowledge that what she was feeling was a normal part of a documented recovery process did not make the feeling itself any less real or any less exhausting. What it did do, eventually and gradually, was prevent her from interpreting those bad days as evidence that she wasn't getting better, that she would never get better, that the version of herself she was working toward was a destination she simply wasn't capable of reaching. Distinguishing between a bad day and a permanent state turned out to be one of the most practically important skills she developed during her recovery, and she has told more than one woman on the crisis hotline the same thing in almost exactly those words. 2 years after the confrontation in that kitchen, Sarah was asked to speak at a community awareness event organized by the advocacy organization she worked for, an annual gathering focused on intimate partner violence prevention that drew attendees from across the county, including local law enforcement, healthcare workers, school counselors, and members of the general public. She had declined the previous year's invitation, feeling unready to stand in front of an audience and use her own story as a teaching tool. But something had shifted in the intervening year, a settling that she recognized as distinct from the performative okayness she had maintained during the marriage and distinct also from the fragile optimism of her first months of recovery. This was something quieter and more durable, a kind of groundedness that didn't depend on circumstances being good or on other people's validation or on the absence of difficulty. She accepted the invitation and spent 3 weeks preparing what she wanted to say, drafting and revising and reading sections aloud in her kitchen until the words felt true rather than merely accurate. She spoke for 22 minutes. She talked about the early years of the marriage and about the process by which control had been established so gradually that she hadn't recognized it as control until she was already deep inside it. She talked about the gap between what her marriage looked like from the outside and what it felt like from the inside, and about the enormous energy she had expended for years managing that gap, making sure no one looked closely enough to see the difference. She talked about the night she called her sister and about what it had meant to have someone answer, not just answer the phone but answer in the deepest sense, showing up completely and without reservation for a situation that required everything they had. She did not describe the specifics of the plan Rachel had executed, partly out of legal prudence and partly because she felt, and still feels, that the specific mechanics of what happened are less important than the underlying truth the whole story points toward, which is that no one should have to navigate a situation like hers alone, and that the difference between surviving and not surviving is often simply the presence of one person willing to stand in the gap when everything else has failed. The room was very quiet while she spoke and very loud when she finished. Several people approached her afterward, some with questions, some with their own stories offered quietly and quickly in the way people share things they haven't said out loud before, some simply wanting to say thank you in the way that means more than the words themselves can carry. One woman, a healthcare professional who had attended the event as part of a continuing education requirement and who had expected to find it professionally informative in a general way, told Sarah afterward that she had spent the entire 22 minutes thinking about a patient she had seen 6 months earlier, a woman who had come into her clinic with an injury explained by a story that hadn't quite added up, and that she had accepted the explanation anyway because confronting it would have required more time than she had that day and more confidence than she felt in her ability to handle whatever came next if the truth turned out to be different from the story she'd been given. She said Sarah's talk had changed the calculation she would use the next time she found herself in that room with that patient with that story that didn't quite add up. Sarah thanked her and meant it, because that specific outcome, one person in one room making one different decision the next time a moment like that arrived, was precisely what she had hoped her story might accomplish when she had finally decided it was worth telling. Rachel heard about the speech from their mother, who had attended and who called her the same evening in a state of emotional overwhelm that she described as the proudest she had ever felt in her entire life, which was saying something considerable for a woman who had watched both her daughters accomplish remarkable things by any reasonable measure. Rachel listened to her mother describe Sarah's 22 minutes at the podium and felt something she has never quite found the right words for, a particular mixture of pride and grief and relief and gratitude that doesn't have a clean name in English, and that she suspects exists as an emotion primarily in the space between people who have been through something serious together and come out the other side still intact. She called Sarah the next morning and they talked for nearly an hour, longer than they usually talked, covering everything and nothing in the way that close siblings sometimes do, when what they most want to communicate isn't something that can be directly said, but can be approximated through enough time spent simply being in each other's presence, even across a phone line, even across the distance that Rachel's career continued to require. The question that hovered over this entire story from the beginning, the question of whether what Rachel did was right, whether the methods she used were justified by the outcomes they produced, whether justice was genuinely served or only approximated through unconventional means in the absence of better options, is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question that lives in the tension between what we want our systems to be capable of and what they actually deliver in specific situations to specific people. Rachel has never claimed that what she did was without complication. She has said clearly and more than once that she operated in a gray area and that she understood that going in. What she has also said, equally clearly, is that she would do it again, because the alternative was leaving her sister inside a situation that had already lasted 6 years and that showed no indication of resolving itself through any of the conventional channels available. When systems fail people, people find other ways to protect each other. That is not an argument against systems. It is simply an observation about human beings and about what love looks like when it runs out of sanctioned options and has to improvise. Sarah Mitchell is still in Ohio. She still works for the same advocacy organization, though her role has expanded significantly since she joined. She still lives in the house that is now entirely and uncomplicatedly hers, and she has said she has no intention of leaving it, because reclaiming that specific space from the fear that once filled it has been one of the most meaningful acts of her recovery, transforming it room by room from a place associated with pain into a place associated with the life she has built since. She has plants in every window now, which is a small detail, but one she mentions specifically when she describes the house. Perhaps because the plants represent something about intention and care and the willingness to tend to living things in a space that once felt like it was slowly diminishing everything that lived inside it. Rachel is still serving. She received a promotion in the year following everything that happened in Ohio, a recognition of performance and leadership that had nothing to do with her sister's situation and everything to do with the career she had built through years of discipline and dedication and the kind of commitment to something larger than herself that had defined her since she was 18 years old and signing papers that would take her away from everything familiar. She and Sarah speak almost every day. They have both said, independently and in different conversations, that the bond between them now carries a quality it didn't have before, not because the events of that year created it, but because those events tested it in a way that revealed its actual depth. And what they found when they looked was something stronger and more substantial than either of them had fully understood was there. This is where we leave them. Not at the confrontation, not at the moment of Derek's exposure, not at the settlement or the job loss or the relocation, but here, in the ordinary ongoing days of two women living their lives, one in Ohio tending her plants and answering phones and sitting with women in the dark, one in a uniform somewhere continuing to show up for whatever the next mission requires. The dramatic part of this story lasted a week. The real story has been going on ever since, quietly and without an audience, the way most real stories do. We want to hear from you before you go. We want to know what part of this story stayed with you the longest, whether it was the plan Rachel executed, the years of Sarah's silence before it, the confrontation itself, or the recovery that followed. We want to know whether you believe the outcome was enough, whether a man who did what Derek Coleman did over 6 years should have faced consequences that extended further into the formal legal system, or whether what he lost was proportionate to what he took. And we want to know, honestly and in your own words, whether there is someone in your own life right now whose situation reminds you of Sarah's in any way, and if so, whether this story changes anything about what you might do or say the next time you're in a room with them. Those are not rhetorical questions. We read every comment, and the conversations that happen below videos like this one are part of why we make them. So please, take a moment, leave your thoughts, and let us know where you are watching from today. Because this community spans more places than you might imagine, and every voice in it matters. If you watch this entire video from beginning to end, thank you. It means more than the number represents. Please subscribe if you haven't already, turn on notifications so you never miss what we put out next, and share this video with one person in your life who you think needs to hear this story today. You never know what a story like this one might unlock for someone who has been waiting for the right moment to recognize something they've been trying not to see.